The morning Julia Carver decided she was done loving Isaiah Ellsworth was the same morning his horse appeared at her fence post without a rider, and she knew, with a certainty that settled in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, that she was not done at all. It was the spring of 1878 in Harlow Creek, a small but stubborn town pressed into the red dirt of West Texas, where the wind never seemed to decide which direction it wanted to blow, and the sun took everything it touched. The town had grown up around a trading post and a church, and in the years since, it had gathered to itself a general store, a livery stable, a saloon that tried to be respectable and failed most evenings, a sheriff's office that had seen 3 sheriffs in 4 years, and a schoolhouse that Julia herself ran 5 days a week with the kind of quiet determination that people in Harlow Creek had come to either admire or be quietly intimidated by. Julia was 26 years old, and she had the look of a woman who had been beautiful for so long that she had stopped noticing it. Her hair was the dark brown of river silt, thick and unruly, and she kept it pinned at the back of her neck in a way that never quite held. Her eyes were gray, the kind of gray that changed with the light, sometimes soft as morning fog and sometimes sharp as flint, and she moved through her days with a purposeful economy that suggested she had a great deal to do and a limited patience for distraction. She had come to Harlow Creek 3 years earlier from San Antonio, following a schoolteacher position advertised in a newspaper, fleeing a quietly miserable engagement to a man named Gerald who had been kind enough but had loved his business ledgers more than he had ever loved her. She had arrived in October of 1875, stepped off a dusty stagecoach with 2 trunks and a box of books, and she had never gone back. Isaiah Ellsworth had been in Harlow Creek for 2 years before she arrived, and he was the sort of man who seemed to have grown up out of the land itself. He was 30 years old in that spring of 1878, tall and lean, with the kind of broad-shouldered build that came from actual work rather than the performance of it. He had dark eyes that held a quality Julia had never quite been able to name, something between amusement and attentiveness, as if he found the world interesting and was always waiting to see what it would do next. He had come to Harlow Creek from somewhere in Tennessee, though he rarely spoke about it, and he ran a cattle operation on a spread of land just east of town, a modest ranch called the Ellsworth Place that he had built himself, post by post and plank by plank, with the help of 2 hired hands named Coop and Dell, who were both somewhere in their 40s, and possessed between them about 3 good opinions. Julia had met Isaiah in her first week in Harlow Creek, at a gathering held by Agnes Whitmore, who threw dinners the way some women waged war, with planning and intention and an eye always on the outcome. He had been sitting at the end of the table talking to the man beside him about the drought conditions that had plagued the previous summer, and he had looked up when she came in and said, simply and without any of the excessive courtesy that some men deployed when encountering a new woman, "You must be the teacher. I heard you brought 3 crates of books." 2 crates, she had corrected, and he had smiled, and that had been the beginning of it. The trouble was that the beginning of it had also been very nearly the end of it, or at least that was what Julia had told herself for the better part of 3 years. They had become friendly, then something more than friendly that neither of them had found a word for, and then Julia had done what she had become very skilled at doing without ever quite realizing she was doing it. She had built a distance. It was not a visible distance, not the kind that could be measured in miles or plotted on a map. It was a distance made of careful words and managed silences, and the particular art of being warm without being open. She had learned it from years of watching her mother love her father from across an invisible expanse that neither of them ever acknowledged, and she had absorbed it so thoroughly that she had come to mistake it for simply how she was built, as if the space between herself and the people she cared about was not a construction but a natural condition, like the space between stars. Isaiah had never quite accepted the distance, but he had been patient with it in the way that a man who understands land understands weather, with respect for its power and the quiet belief that it would eventually change. Now his horse stood at her fence without him, and the stone in her chest was sinking. The horse was a big roan gelding named Copper, who was, among the animals of Harlow Creek, something of a legend for his bad temper and his absolute loyalty to his rider. Copper did not wander. Copper did not leave Isaiah's side without a reason. The fact that he was standing at Julia's fence with his bridle on but no saddle, breathing hard and favoring his left foreleg, meant something had happened somewhere between the Ellsworth place and wherever Isaiah had been going that morning. Julia stood on her porch for approximately 4 seconds before she went inside, pulled on her coat, and went out to the horse. She checked the foreleg. It was not broken, but the horse had taken a stone bruise badly enough to make him reluctant to put his full weight on it. She led him to her small shelter and put him in the shade with water. Then she went back inside, changed into her riding clothes, borrowed the elderly mare she kept for practical purposes, and rode east toward the Ellsworth place. The morning was the kind of cool that fooled you in West Texas, the kind that made you think it might stay reasonable, and then let the sun have its way with everything by noon. The land stretched flat and red and stubbled with scrub oak and cedar, and the sky above it was a blue so deep it seemed to press down. Julia rode without hurrying because hurrying a horse on uncertain ground was foolish, but she rode steadily, and she watched the land as she went. She found him 3/4 of a mile from his property line, sitting with his back against a cedar tree with his left boot off and his face tilted up toward the sky. He had a cut along his jaw that had bled enough to leave a dark stain on his collar, and his left ankle was wrapped in what appeared to be a strip of his own shirt-tail. He did not look alarmed when she appeared. He looked, if anything, mildly relieved and slightly amused, which was a combination that should have annoyed Julia and did annoy Julia and also made something soft and involuntary happen behind her sternum. "Copper made it to you," he said. "He did." She dismounted and came toward him. "What happened?" "Rattler spooked him about a mile out. He threw me before I could do anything about it, took the stone bruise on the way down and went on to find his own company." He glanced at his foot. "I rolled the ankle. I do not think it is broken." "Let me see." She crouched beside him, and he extended his foot without argument. She unwound the makeshift bandage and pressed carefully along the bone. He did not flinch, which either meant it was not broken or meant he was the kind of man who did not flinch, and she suspected it was both. The ankle was swollen and beginning to show the yellow-purple of a bruise working its way to the surface, but the bone held true under her fingers. "Not broken," she confirmed, "but you should not be walking on it for at least 2 days. That is inconvenient. Most injuries are." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that quality she could never name, and she looked back down at his ankle and rewound the strip of cotton more firmly. "Can you ride if I help you mount?" "I can ride." "Then we will take you back to your place. Your hands can manage things for 2 days. Coop will complain." "Coop complains when the weather is good," she said, and Isaiah laughed, a sound that moved through the air between them like something alive. She helped him up, and he was heavier than he looked because he was solid, all of him, the way men who worked land were solid. And for a moment he was leaning against her, and she was aware of the warmth of him, the cedar smell and the sun-warmed leather, and she moved quickly to get him to the mare before her face could betray anything. They rode back to his property together, and she helped him inside while Coop and Dell came out from the barn, with the expressions of men who had been expecting trouble, and were satisfied to see their expectations confirmed. She saw Isaiah settled on the long wooden bench in his front room, his foot elevated on a feed sack, and she said she would come back the following day to check on him, and he said he would appreciate that, and neither of them said anything else. And she rode home in the early afternoon sun thinking about the way his hand had held her arm for balance when she had helped him dismount, and how she had stepped away from that grip the moment it was safe to do so. The distance was so practiced, she barely felt herself maintaining it anymore. It had become automatic, like breathing, like the way her fingers found the chalk before she had consciously decided to write something on the board. She loved Isaiah Ellsworth with a depth and specificity that she had never allowed herself to fully examine, because examining it would require acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would require doing something about it, and doing something about it would require risking something. And risk was the one thing Julia Carver had organized her entire interior life to avoid. She had loved him since approximately the 3rd month she had lived in Harlow Creek, when she had been sitting in the general store going through her supply order, and he had come in and set a small stack of books on the counter beside her without a word and said, "These belonged to a circuit preacher who left them at my place last fall. I think they would be better used in a schoolroom." There had been a collection of McGuffey readers, 2 mathematics primers, and a worn but complete copy of Shakespeare's histories that she had gasped over in a way she was not proud of, and he had watched her gasp with those dark eyes and said nothing else and gone to buy his flour and gone home. She had loved him then, and she had loved him through every season since. Through the summer he had helped her repair the schoolhouse roof when a windstorm took half the shingles. Through the winter she had been ill with a chest fever, and he had sent Dell to her door every morning with soup without ever appearing himself. Through the autumn she had nearly convinced herself that Deputy Tom Havers was a perfectly reasonable man to consider. And Isaiah had said nothing, but looked at her in a way that made Tom Havers seem like a rough draft of a person. She had kept it contained and managed and at arm's length, and she had told herself this was maturity and self-preservation and wisdom, and the truth was that it was fear dressed in sensible clothing. She went back the following day as she had promised, and the day after that, because his ankle was worse before it was better, as these things were, and she found herself sitting at his kitchen table in the late afternoon of the 2nd day drinking coffee that was too strong and watching him read, because he had grown up in a house with books, and he read the way some men smoked, habitually and with pleasure, and she liked watching him read more than she had ever admitted to anyone, including herself. "You are staring," he said without looking up. "I am assessing your color," she said. "You had a head injury from the fall. I did not hit my head. You might have." He put the book down and looked at her with the amusement and the attentiveness and something else she was not ready to identify. "Julia," he said. She picked up her coffee. "Your hands are managing well enough. Coop seems to have opinions about the spring planting. Coop always has opinions about the spring planting. Julia." "What?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, but the kind that had weight to it, the kind that was preparing to carry something. "How long do you intend to keep doing this?" She set the coffee cup down with a precision that was not quite steady. "Doing what?" "Being here and not being here at the same time." The silence that followed this was the loudest she could remember in recent years. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar, and somewhere down toward the barn coop was complaining about something in the middle distance, and the afternoon light lay gold and flat across the plank floor between them. "I do not know what you mean," she said, which was the most complete lie she had told in some time. Isaiah Ellsworth, who had spent 3 years being patient with her and watching her keep him at a distance that he had never quite accepted, leaned forward in his chair and said, quietly and with a directness she had always known was in him, "You know exactly what I mean." She stood up. She was very good at standing up when conversations became what they were becoming. She said something about needing to get back before dark, and he said her name again, and she put on her coat and went to the door, and she was almost through it when he said, "I am not going anywhere, Julia. I will wait as long as you need, but I want you to know that I am waiting, and I want you to understand what I am waiting for." She walked out without answering, which was both her worst and most characteristic response to things that mattered, and she rode home in the gold and failing light of a Texas afternoon, feeling the distance between them like a rope she had tied herself to pull tight every time it went slack. She spent the next week in an irritable state that her students navigated with the experienced caution of children who had learned their teachers' moods. She was not cruel. She was never cruel, but she was short with interruptions and overly precise about grammar. And she gave a spelling test on a Friday when tradition held that Fridays in Harlow Creek were for reading aloud. An 8-year-old Thomas Becket, who was sweet and observant, asked her if she was sad about something, and she told him firmly that she was perfectly well and gave him an extra word to spell. She went to church on Sunday and sat 3 rows behind Isaiah, who had come on his recovered horse and was walking without a limp, and she watched the back of his head for the entire sermon and absorbed nothing of what Reverend Doyle said, which meant she got the full benefit of neither the spiritual instruction nor the distraction she had been hoping for. After the service, in the yard where people gathered and the women compared notes on their gardens, and the men talked about cattle prices, and the single ongoing question of whether the railroad would come through Harlow Creek or pass to the north through Minden, Agnes Whitmore appeared at Julia's elbow with the precision of a woman who had been positioning herself to appear there for some time. "You look tired," Agnes said, which was how Agnes always opened a conversation she had planned. "I am perfectly fine," Julia said. "Isaiah looked well," Agnes said casually in the direction of the fence where Isaiah was talking to the sheriff. "His ankle must have healed. He is resilient." "He is a great many things," Agnes said, with a smile that had entirely too much knowledge in it. Agnes Whitmore was 53 years old and had been married to her husband Harold for 31 of those years, and had opinions about love that she delivered with the serene confidence of a woman who felt that witnessing a thing for long enough entitled you to speak on it. "He rode all the way out to the Anderson farm last Tuesday when old Hank Anderson's fence line went down. Spent the whole day. Did not charge a cent. That is kind of him. It is more than kind, it is the kind of man he is." Agnes turned to look at her directly. "Julia, I have known you for 3 years, and I have watched you and Isaiah circle each other like 2 planets that cannot decide whether to collide or drift, and I have held my tongue for most of that time, which I think you will agree has been a considerable exercise of restraint." Julia looked at her with the expression she reserved for people who were about to say something true that she did not want to hear. "Whatever is holding you back," Agnes said, more gently, "it is your own, and you know that, do you not?" Julia looked away. Across the churchyard, Isaiah was laughing at something the sheriff had said, his head tilted back, and the morning light was on his face, and the distance between them was exactly as wide as she had built it, and she was the only one who had ever been on its far side. "I know," she said quietly, and Agnes squeezed her arm once and moved away to intercept her husband before he committed some social error with the Milner family, and Julia stood with that knowledge settling into her like something she had always known and had been working very hard not to acknowledge. The town of Harlow Creek was, like all small towns in that part of Texas in 1878, a place where everyone's business was more or less everyone's business, and the business of the general store was conducted by a man named Reuben Fitch, who was simultaneously the most important information hub in the community and the least discreet keeper of that information. It was Reuben who told Julia, on a Monday afternoon in early April when she came in for chalk and paper, that there had been some trouble with the cattle on the eastern range. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, because she knew the eastern range was near the Ellsworth property. "Rustlers," Reuben said, with the relish of a man delivering significant news. "Hit the Ellsworth place and the Chandler place both 3 nights ago. Took about 40 head from Ellsworth and 20 from Chandler. Sheriff Aldridge has been out there this morning." Julia bought her chalk and paper and went home and stood in her kitchen thinking about 40 head of cattle, which to a modest operation like the Ellsworth place was not a catastrophe, but was serious enough to matter. And then she thought about the fact that Isaiah had not mentioned it when she had seen him briefly at the post office the previous Friday, which meant he had been carrying it without saying anything, which was his particular version of keeping distance, not the kind Julia built but a different kind. The kind that came from a lifetime of solving his own problems quietly. She thought about that distinction for longer than was probably useful. She thought about how his distance was one of self-reliance, a habit of not burdening, and how hers was one of self-protection, a habit of not risking, and how neither of them was serving the situation particularly well. She made supper, she graded papers, she went to bed, and in the morning she got up and taught school, and when the afternoon released her she went to the Ellsworth place directly. Coop and Dell were somewhere in the eastern field when she arrived. Isaiah was at the barn, working on a section of fence that had been pulled down in the rustler's passage, and he looked up when he heard her horse and then kept working, which was either rude or honest, and she decided it was honest. "Reuben Fitch told me," she said. "I expected he would. Why did you not say something Friday?" He drove a nail home and straightened and looked at her. "Because I did not want you to feel obligated to come here." The precision of this landed cleanly. She got down from her horse and looped the rein over the fence post and walked to where he was standing and looked at him in the warm afternoon light. "Isaiah," she said, "Julia, I want to come here." He looked at her steadily, and there was something careful in him, the kind of carefulness of a man who had been on the receiving end of 3 years of almost, and was not going to move too quickly toward what that sentence might mean. "All right," he said. "I want to come here," she said again, and then, because it was time and she knew it was time even though the knowing of it was the most frightening thing she had felt since stepping off that stagecoach in October of 1875, "because of you. Not the ankle, not the rustlers, not because Agnes Whitmore is managing me. Because of you and because I have been standing at the far end of something I built myself, and I think it is time I stopped pretending I do not know that." The afternoon held very still. The barn wood ticked in the heat. One of the remaining cattle lowed somewhere behind the pasture fence. Isaiah set down the hammer. He did not rush, which was characteristic, and he looked at her for a moment that felt longer than moments usually were, and then he said, "How long have you known?" "Since about December of 1875, she said. "The books." Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before, something that was not the amusement or the attentiveness but was instead simply open as land without trees, without any of the managed quality that people put over things they had been guarding. "I brought those books," he said slowly, "because I wanted a reason to talk to you for 5 minutes without it being a coincidence." "I know," she said. "And then you thanked me very formally and looked at the Shakespeare as if it were a living creature, and I walked home thinking about you the entire way." "I know that too," she said, because she had suspected it then and had folded the suspicion away carefully into the drawer of things she did not open, and she was done with that drawer now. She was done with all of it, done with the careful management and the strategic warmth and the art of being present while remaining untouchable. "I am sorry it took me this long." He crossed the space between them then, the space she had maintained for 3 years, and he did it without hurrying and without hesitation, and he took her face in both his hands, which were calloused and warm and entirely gentle, and he looked at her for a moment in which she felt completely seen in a way that should have frightened her and did not frighten her at all, and then he kissed her. It was not the kind of kiss that happened in the novels she kept on her shelf at home, the breathless, dizzy kind that the heroines of those books experienced in well-lit parlors. It was quieter than that and more real, the kind of kiss that carried 3 years of patience and the specific tenderness of something long wanted and finally arrived at, and when it ended, she stood very still with her hands against his chest and her heart doing something entirely uncharacteristic, and she thought clearly and without any anxiety whatsoever, "There it is. I should have done this 3 months after you arrived," he said quietly near her ear. "You should have," she agreed. "But I would have been terrible about it." "Yes," he said honestly, and she laughed, and he held her while she did, and the distance she had built and maintained and defended, and at some point entirely forgotten she had built herself, closed for good. The rustling situation was not resolved as quickly as the kiss, which was how life in the actual West of 1878 operated. Sheriff Aldridge was a competent man named Marcus Aldridge, who had been in the position for 18 months, and was the best of the three sheriffs Harlow Creek had seen, and he had ridden out with his deputy to track the stolen cattle north toward the Pecos River country. The problem was that the men who had taken the cattle were operating as part of a loosely organized outfit that had been hitting small ranches across that part of Texas for the better part of a year, running stolen stock into New Mexico territory, where the brands were harder to trace, and the markets were cooperative with people who did not ask many questions. Isaiah lost those 40 head, which meant a difficult spring financially, and he spoke about this to Julia one evening on the porch of her house with a plainness that she understood was a significant act of trust coming from a man who had always managed his difficulties quietly. He was sitting in the chair she had brought out for visitors, and she was sitting on the porch edge with her feet dangling, and the evening air had the particular sweetness of a Texas April that made up for a great deal of what the summer would become. "I can manage," he said. "The winter herd is solid. I lose the margin for this season and I make it back next year if the prices hold." Is that what Coop thinks? Coop thinks everything is a sign of impending catastrophe, so his opinion is of limited use as a barometer. He paused. "But yes, that is more or less the shape of it. I am not in danger of losing the place." "I was not asking because I was worried about the place," she said. He glanced at her. "What were you asking?" "I was asking how you are, not the cattle. You." This simple distinction appeared to land with more force than she intended, and he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was actually considering the question rather than answering reflexively. "I am all right," he said, and then, with the kind of honesty that was new between them and felt like walking on ice that had just been tested and found solid, "I am better than I have been in some time in the ways that matter most." She looked at him in the evening light. "Isaiah." "What?" "Come over here." He moved from the chair to the porch edge beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she leaned her head against him, and they sat in the warm April dark listening to the night sounds of the Texas plain, the insects, and the distant cattle and the wind in the cedar. And Julia thought that this specific texture of being beside someone rather than beside the idea of someone, was the thing she had been keeping herself from for 3 years with her practiced architecture of distance. And it was so simple and so good that it made the 3 years feel like an almost comic exercise in unnecessary self-denial. The spring moved forward. The school term continued through the end of May, and Julia taught and graded, and held her reading circles on Friday afternoons when a small group of town women came in to read and discuss. And she began the process of quietly letting people see that there was something different between her and Isaiah without making any announcements about it. Because this was Harlow Creek and announcements were redundant when Reuben Fitch existed. By the second week of May, Agnes Whitmore had smiled at her in church with such complete satisfaction that Julia had to look away before the smile became contagious. And by the third week, Tom Havers, who had eventually married a pleasant woman named Dorothy and seemed genuinely happy, stopped her on the street and told her that Isaiah was a good man, and she deserved a good man, which was kind and a little strange, but she appreciated it. Isaiah came to supper on 3 evenings in that first month, bringing things from his kitchen in the way men who cooked for themselves developed opinions about what was good. A jar of preserved apricots, once a rabbit he had prepared himself and which was better than she expected, and once simply a loaf of bread that Coop had made, because Coop, it turned out, baked bread with genuine skill, which Isaiah explained was the thing that had kept him employed through any number of other shortcomings. On those evenings they talked. Not the managed, careful conversation of before, but the real kind, the kind that went from the practical to the philosophical without any particular route, and arrived at things neither of them had planned to say. She told him about Gerald and the ledgers in San Antonio, and he told her about Tennessee, about a farm he had grown up on with 2 older brothers and a father who had expected the boys to have opinions and be able to defend them, and about how he had come west at 23 because he had needed to build something that was his own in a way that the Tennessee farm, always his father's, could never quite be. She asked him once why he had waited during those 3 years, rather than pressing harder or simply deciding she was not worth the patience, and he thought about it with the seriousness he brought to real questions and said, "Because I could see that the distance was not you. It was something you were doing. And those are different things, and it seemed like it mattered which one it was before deciding how to respond to it." Julia sat with this observation for a long time. It was one of the more perceptive things anyone had ever said to her about herself, and it had the additionally humbling quality of being entirely correct. The distance had never been who she was. It had been what she was doing, out of fear, out of the particular learned pattern of her mother's love and the near miss of Gerald, and the general caution of someone who had watched people she loved leave or diminish or fail to show up. And she had done it so long and so automatically that she had genuinely forgotten she was doing it. He had seen through it from the beginning, or near enough to the beginning, and he had waited without making her feel waited upon, which was a considerable skill. "You are a remarkably patient man," she said. "I am patient about the things worth being patient about," he said. "I am not particularly patient about poor fence work or bad coffee." "Your coffee is too strong." "My coffee is correctly strong," he said firmly, and she laughed and he smiled, and the evening settled around them like something they had made together. It was in June that the second significant trouble arrived, and it arrived in the form of a man named Ward Kellum, who came into Harlow Creek on a Thursday afternoon with 3 men behind him, and an air of proprietary authority that suggested he had decided before arriving that the town and its surrounding land owed him something. Ward Kellum was, as it developed, a land agent working for a railroad speculation company operating out of Dallas that had been buying up or pressuring out small landowners along a potential southern corridor route. This was 1878, and the railroad was a serious matter in West Texas, and the speculation companies that preceded actual construction were already operating in ways that ranged from straightforwardly dishonest to technically legal, but designed to achieve outcomes that were not in the interest of the people they were dealing with. Kellum had already worked through 2 counties to the east, and what he had left behind him, there were ranchers who had sold for less than their land was worth under conditions that had not been entirely voluntary, and a general climate of anxiety about who would be next. He set himself up in the saloon, which was also the only hotel in Harlow Creek, and within 2 days he had called on the sheriff to announce his intentions, which he described as offering fair market rates for land along the proposed corridor, and he had begun calling on the ranchers whose properties fell within or near that corridor. The Ellsworth place was within the corridor. Isaiah told her about Kellum's visit on a Friday evening, sitting at her kitchen table, and his face had the particular stillness it got when he was managing something strong. "He offered me $1,100 for the whole property," he said. "That is not what it is worth. No, the land alone is worth twice that, and the cattle and improvements on top of it put it well above that. He knows that. He is making a low offer on the assumption that the people he approaches either do not know what their land is worth or feel that they do not have other options." "What did you tell him?" "I told him no." She looked at him, and he suggested the railroad's arrival might change conditions for land values in ways that might not be advantageous to those who had not sold at the right time. It was the kind of suggestion that is meant to sound like a warning without being specific enough to be a threat. Julia set her hands flat on the table in the way she did when she was thinking precisely. "He is doing what they did in Palo Pinto County last year," she said. Isaiah looked at her with mild surprise and she said, "I read the newspaper, Isaiah. He will work through the individual ranchers with low offers and implied pressure, and if enough of them sell, it creates a situation where the holdouts are isolated and the implied pressure becomes more explicit. That is my reading of it too. What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment, The ranchers around here need to know what he is doing and what their land is actually worth. If everyone has the same information and the same understanding, it is much harder for him to work the division he is counting on. You should talk to the sheriff. I will, and I should talk to the other ranchers, but I want to be careful about how it is done. If it looks like I am organizing opposition, he will report that to his company and they will escalate the approach. Julia thought about this. Agnes Whitmore's husband Harold has a cousin who is a surveyor working the county land office records out of San Angelo. He could give you the proper assessed values. That is public record. Isaiah looked at her. That is a good thought. I have them occasionally, she said. He smiled, and it was the warm kind, the kind that was specifically for her. More than occasionally. The next 2 weeks in Harlow Creek were lively in the way that small towns become lively when something of real consequence is unfolding within them. Isaiah spoke to the sheriff and to Harold Whitmore, who wrote to his cousin in San Angelo. The cousin, a careful man named Fletcher, wrote back with the assessed values for the corridor parcels and the relevant legal information about railroad easement law, which was more protective of landowners than Kellum had been representing. Isaiah shared this information with each of the ranchers Kellum had approached or was likely to approach, and he did it quietly and without making it a confrontation, which meant Kellum did not know it was happening until it was already done. Julia watched this process with something that was not entirely different from admiration, because the quality Isaiah was displaying was not just patience, but a particular kind of strategic intelligence that operated without aggression, and she had always found that kind of intelligence attractive in a way that was hard to articulate. She also found, to her own slight surprise, that she was useful. She knew things about the town and the people in it, because she had been teaching their children for 3 years, and because she was the kind of person who listened well, and more than once she gave Isaiah information or a perspective that shifted his approach in a way that made a difference. They talked through the problem together in the evenings on her porch or at his kitchen table, and the talking through of it together had a quality that was new and good, the quality of two people who had discovered they were genuinely useful to each other as thinking partners, which was a different, and in some ways more durable pleasure than simply wanting each other. Kellum made 3 more attempts to purchase Ellsworth land, each more explicitly pressuring than the last, and on the 3rd attempt he came with a legal document that purported to give the railroad company an eminent domain claim on the corridor property. Sheriff Aldridge looked at the document and sent it to a lawyer in San Angelo, who examined it and wrote back that it was not, in fact, legally valid, as the railroad company had not yet secured the state legislative authorization required for an eminent domain action in that county. This information arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, Kellum and his men had left Harlow Creek, having secured only 2 of the 9 properties he had targeted, both of which had been sold by people who had decided they were ready to move on regardless of the circumstances and had not been coerced. The Ellsworth place remained Isaiah's, all of it, every post and plank. On the Friday evening after Kellum left, Isaiah came to Julia's porch with a bottle of wine that had been sent up from San Antonio with one of the freighting wagons, because Harlow Creek Saloon ran to whiskey and beer, and the occasional unfortunate attempt at brandy, but did not reliably stock wine. And he poured 2 glasses, and handed her one, and they sat together in the early summer evening, with the cedar smell and the warm air, and the stars coming out one by one over the flat Texas sky. "To not selling," she said. "To not selling," he agreed, and they drank. After a while he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. The stars were well established by now, the Milky Way beginning its slow lean across the sky the way it did on clear Texas nights when there was no moon. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I have wanted to ask you for some time. I'm asking now because the property is secured and the situation is resolved, and those practical matters are no longer a reason to wait, and I do not have any other reason to wait." Julia's hands were still on her glass. The wine was good, better than anything she had had in months, and the evening was the best kind, and the man beside her was the person she had been loving from a distance for 3 years, because she had forgotten that the distance was her own construction, and she had been on the right side of that distance now for 2 months, and it was the best 2 months she could remember. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. "Yes. Yes," she said again. "I am saying yes. Do not make me say it a third time, or I will become suspicious that you need the repetition for confidence, and that will concern me about your overall self-assurance." He laughed, the real one, the one that came from somewhere genuine in him, and he set his glass down and took hers from her hands and set it down too, and he kissed her in the evening light with the stars above the Texas plain and the cedar smell in the warm air, and she held on to him with both hands and felt nothing that resembled distance anywhere in her. They told Agnes Whitmore the following Sunday, which was the equivalent of telling the entire town, and Agnes cried in the controlled and dignified way of a woman who had been expecting this outcome for some time and was not surprised but was moved. And Harold Whitmore shook Isaiah's hand with the approval of a man who had been waiting to do so. And the rest of Harlow Creek followed the announcement with the warm enthusiasm of a community that had been watching something slowly happen and was satisfied to see it arrive. Reuben Fitch heard about it before the Monday morning. He always heard about things before the Monday morning. They were married in August of 1878 in the Harlow Creek Church on a morning that started cool and did not stay that way, which was entirely predictable for August in West Texas, and which Julia had accounted for by choosing the lightest fabric she could find from the dry goods shipment Agnes had helped her select from, a cream-colored lawn cotton that moved in the air and did not hold heat as badly as heavier things. She stood in the back of the church with Agnes beside her doing something complicated with her hair, and thought about the fact that she was about to marry Isaiah Ellsworth, and felt not a particle of anxiety about it, which was novel, because Julia Carver had spent a great deal of her life feeling particles of anxiety about most things that mattered. What she felt instead was a deep and grounded certainty of the specific kind that comes not from the absence of knowing a thing fully, but from knowing it very well and finding it good. She knew Isaiah. She knew the way he was quiet when things were difficult, and how he could be moved by books, and how he made coffee too strong and worked with his hands better than most men she had ever seen, and was patient in ways that were not passive and honest in ways that were not unkind. She knew that he had waited 3 years for her to stop building distances, and that he had done it without resentment, which was the kind of love that was not a performance or a strategy but simply a character. She walked down the aisle of the small church on her own, because her father had died when she was 14 and she had no brother, and she had told Isaiah she would walk herself, and he had said that seemed exactly right, and she walked toward him standing at the front of the church in his good dark coat with coupe, and Dell in the front pew looking like men who had been told to wear clean shirts and had complied under protest. And she looked at his face when she reached him, and he was looking at her with the open quality she had first seen that afternoon at the barn when she had told him the truth about the distance. And Reverend Doyle said the words, and they said their words back, and it was done in the best way something can be done, thoroughly and without reservation. The reception was in the churchyard, which was how things were done in Harlow Creek, because the church was the largest indoor space available, and the August heat made outdoors preferable anyway. And there was food enough for 3 times the people present, and someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing on the packed dirt of the churchyard until the stars were fully out, and the lanterns were lit, and children who should have been in bed were still running between the legs of the adults. Julia danced with Isaiah 3 times and stood beside him for the rest, his hand in hers or at the small of her back, and she felt the solidity of his presence as a new kind of familiar, the kind that you have been missing without knowing you were missing it, and that settling into you feels like remembering rather than learning. Agnes danced with Harold and cried twice more, with increasing dignity, and Coop was discovered to be a surprisingly effective dancing partner for the widow Mrs. Patterson from the eastern end of town, which created a conversation thread that lasted well into September. They spent their first night at the Ellsworth place, which was now Julia's place as well, and in the morning she woke early to the specific quality of light that came in through the east window of the bedroom and lay in it thinking that this room, this house, this particular geometry of morning light and cedar smell and the sound of the land outside, was hers now in a way that felt new and right. And Isaiah woke a little later and looked at her in the morning light and said, "Hello," and she said, "Hello." And neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while. She kept the school. This had been a matter of brief discussion and no real debate, because Isaiah had never assumed that marrying him meant stopping the work she had built, and she had never considered that it might. And they were of one mind on the subject in the way that people are of one mind when they have talked about the things that matter before the necessity of talking about them becomes urgent. She rode to the schoolhouse each morning on the elderly mare, who was getting up in years, and whom Isaiah had diplomatically suggested might be ready for a less demanding role. And she taught through the autumn term with the same precision and the same care, with the added quality of a woman whose interior landscape had changed enough that the children noticed it in a way they could not articulate, but which expressed itself as a general increase in the classroom's warmth. Thomas Beckett, who had asked her in the spring if she was sad, came to her after school one afternoon in September and said, very seriously, for he was a serious 8-year-old, that she seemed happier now, and she told him she was, and he nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose diagnosis had been confirmed and went home. The autumn of 1878 in Harlow Creek was marked by two things of note beyond the personal. The first was that Sheriff Aldridge caught up with two of the men who had been involved in the rustling of the Ellsworth cattle, tracking them through a connection established with a marshal working the New Mexico Territory side of the operation. Isaiah recovered 23 of his 40 head, which was not all of it but was enough to make the spring financial picture considerably better than the summer had suggested. The second thing was the arrival of a family named Prescott from Tennessee, which was a coincidence that amused Isaiah when they came into town. A mother and father and 3 children who had heard the land to the west was still available for homesteading, and had come to find out if that was true. Isaiah knew of the family slightly, as Tennessee was not so large that people from the same broad region had no connection, and he introduced himself to the father, a man named Robert Prescott who was quiet and capable-looking, and Julia met the mother, Eleanor Prescott, who had the look of a woman who had made a decision and was going to live inside it without complaint, which was a look Julia recognized. The Prescotts took up land south of town and became, over the following months, the kind of neighbors that small communities need, the kind who work without complaint and participate without taking over and bring with them useful skills. In this case, Robert's expertise with irrigation techniques that would prove valuable in a county, always negotiating with insufficient water. The winter came down in December with the north wind that Texas winters brought, cold and direct and uninterested in compromise. And Julia and Isaiah settled into the domestic rhythms of the Ellsworth ranch, with the ease of people who had, in some sense, been building toward this specific arrangement for 3 years. She brought her books from the small house in town where she had rented, and the books filled the shelves Isaiah had built and then required additional shelves, which he built without complaint, and with what she suspected was genuine pleasure, because he was a man who liked building things, and adding shelves for books was a project he could feel good about on multiple levels. She learned his patterns. He woke early, earlier than she did, and there was always coffee made when she came into the kitchen, too strong, reliably, unfailingly too strong, and she drank it because it was his coffee, and because the argument about the strength of it had become a running pleasantry that neither of them wanted to resolve. He read in the evenings after supper, or they read together, which was a pleasure Julia had not known she was missing, and which had the quality of an old habit discovered rather than a new one established. On Sundays they rode out over the land together, over the Ellsworth property and beyond it into the open range, and he knew the land the way she knew the books she had been reading since childhood, with the intimate and specific affection of someone who has been paying close and loving attention for a long time. She learned also the ways he was difficult, because everyone is difficult in their particular ways, and Isaiah's were real, if not dramatic. He was private about his worries in a way that required her active attention to notice, not because he was hiding them, but because his instinct was to carry things alone, and she had to learn the specific signs, a certain set of his jaw, a quietness that was a different quality than his ordinary quietness, that indicated he was managing something he had not yet brought out into shared air. She told him once, after she had identified this pattern and confirmed it with enough evidence to be confident, that she was not interested in being protected from the things that troubled him, that she would rather be in the trouble with him than be sheltered from it. And he had listened to this with the full attention he brought to things that mattered and said, "I hear you." And after that he was not perfect about it, but he was better, and she understood that this was how real change worked. Not all at once, but in the direction of all at once. She also learned, with the particular pleasure of being close to a person whose interior life continued to reveal itself, that he was funny in ways that did not announce themselves. Not the loud kind of funny, not the performative kind, but the dry and precise kind that arrived when you were not braced for it and hit therefore with more force. She had known this in the abstract from 3 years of proximity, but knowing it within the dailiness of their life together was different and better, and she caught herself laughing more than she could remember laughing since she was a girl in her father's house, which was the last place she had lived where she had fully trusted the ground. By January of 1879, she knew she was pregnant. She knew it the way women who are attentive to their own bodies know it, not dramatically or with certainty all at once, but as an accumulating evidence that resolved itself one morning into clear knowledge. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days, which was not keeping it from Isaiah, but was giving herself the private space to settle into it, to let it become real to her before it became a conversation. And then on a Sunday evening after supper she told him. He was still at the table with his coffee, and he looked at her when she said it with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that was deeper than surprise and quieter than joy but contained both, the kind of response that comes when something you had not let yourself fully hope for arrives, and you are caught without your preparedness. "Are you certain?" he said. "Reasonably certain," she said. "I will see about a doctor when the weather permits the ride to Minden." Minden was the nearest town with an actual physician. "How are you feeling?" "Somewhat unwell in the mornings, otherwise well." He reached across the table and took her hand, and he held it in his the way he held things he was being careful with, and he did not say anything for a moment, and she watched his face and saw everything in it that she needed to see. "I am glad," he said. "So am I," she said. They rode to Minden in February on a clear, cold day when the roads were solid, and the physician, Dr. Hartwell, confirmed what Julia already knew and placed the arrival at July or August, and gave her the standard advices of the period, which Julia received with the polite attention of a woman who had been reading since the age of 5, and had some opinions about medical advice, but understood the value of maintaining a cooperative relationship with the available physician. The spring of 1879 was the best spring Julia could remember in Texas. The winter rains had been sufficient for once, and the range was green in the early weeks of March in a way that was unusual and beautiful, and the cattle were healthy, and the calves were coming in good numbers, and the Ellsworth place, with its additional shelves of books and its 2 strong-willed occupants and its 2 strong coffee, was the most complete place Julia had ever lived. She taught through April and into May, until the pregnancy became noticeable enough that the question of propriety in a schoolroom became unavoidable, not because she had any personal objection to being visibly pregnant in front of children, who she thought could do with a normalized view of the natural world, but because the parents of those children held views that were conventional for 1879, and she did not want to give anyone a reason to question her position. She arranged for the school to close out the term early in May, which only cost 3 weeks of instruction, and left detailed lesson plans with Agnes Whitmore, whose daughter Caroline, who was 19 and had received more education than most young women in Harlow Creek, agreed to see the remaining students through their examinations. The summer was warm, as summers in West Texas were, and Julia was large with the child, and she spent the long, warm evenings on the porch reading or talking with Isaiah about everything and nothing. And in July, on a hot Thursday afternoon when a storm was building to the west, and the air had the charged quality of weather intending to arrive, their son was born. Dr. Hartwell had come from Minden 2 days prior, staying at the Whitmore house in anticipation of the delivery, and it was Agnes who was in the room with Julia through the labor, and it was Agnes's voice that was the first one Julia heard clearly after the long hours of it, saying, "Julia, you have a son." And then there was the sound of a child insisting on his existence with considerable force, which Julia found encouraging, and then Isaiah was there because Dr. Hartwell had allowed it in a moment of progressive thinking that Agnes later described as civilized, and Isaiah held his son for the first time with the same carefulness he brought to things he was being careful with. But more, much more, and Julia watched his face from the bed, and felt something that was not a word in any language she had access to, but was approximately the sum of every right thing she had ever known. They named him Thomas Samuel Ellsworth, Thomas for the uncle in Tennessee Isaiah had spoken about with particular warmth, Samuel for Julia's father. They called him Sam from the beginning, because Thomas Becket already occupied the name Thomas in the immediate emotional landscape, and it seemed right, and also because Sam suited him, a round and certain and direct sort of baby who ate vigorously and slept adequately, and regarded the world from his first weeks with the attentive quality that Julia recognized immediately as his father's. Coop and Dell came to see the baby with the expressions of men who were not sure what the appropriate response to a baby was, and were managing it by being very still, and Coop, who had continued the unlikely courtship of Mrs. Patterson from the eastern end of town to the general amusement of everyone, said that the baby had a good face, which was the most Coop was capable of in terms of emotional generosity, and was accepted in the spirit intended. Agnes cried, the 4th time she had cried in connection with Isaiah and Julia, and showed no signs of stopping being moved by developments in their lives, which Julia had stopped being surprised by and had come to find genuinely touching. Sam Ellsworth grew. He grew through the rest of that year and into 1880 with the focused industry of healthy babies, and the Ellsworth place adapted around him, the way houses adapt around children, acquiring the soft furniture and the secured shelves, and the particular ambient noise of a small person working out the logistics of existence. Julia returned to the school in the autumn, bringing Sam with her for the first months until he was old enough to be left with Dell, who turned out to have an extraordinary and entirely unexpected facility with small children that he explained by reference to a younger brother he had helped raise back in Georgia. And Sam spent his mornings in the barn with Dell learning what chickens were, and what horses were, and what the names for tools were. Isaiah watched his son with the same quality he brought to watching things he found interesting and was patient about, and Julia watched Isaiah watch Sam and thought, in moments that were not dramatic but were complete, that this was what it looked like when a distance closed permanently, when the space between people became not a gap but simply the air they shared, inhabited together and warm with use. In the autumn of 1880, a letter arrived from Tennessee. It was from Isaiah's oldest brother, a man named Caleb, and it said that their father had died in September and that the farm would be going to Caleb as the eldest, as had always been understood, but that their father had left Isaiah, in the will, his library. The library was 14 boxes of books, which arrived by freight wagon 2 months later, and which required 4 new shelves and rearrangement of the entire study, and a full Sunday of unpacking that Julia and Isaiah did together while Sam napped, opening each box with the specific pleasure of people who love books and find new ones, and which contained, among other things, 3 volumes of Shakespeare that Isaiah held for a moment before setting carefully on the shelf. He did not talk about his father's death at length, because he was a man who processed grief in the private way, but Julia knew the signs by now, and she was with him in the particular way that closeness allowed, present without requiring him to perform the grief differently than it was, and after a week or so, the particular set of his jaw that she recognized as managed sorrow eased. And he talked about his father one evening with the clear-eyed assessment of an adult son who had known his father as a complicated person rather than a simple one, someone who had built the respect for books and the capacity for patience, and also someone whose expectations had made the Tennessee farm a place. Isaiah had needed to leave. He sent the library, Julia said. He did, Isaiah said. He would not have sent them to someone he did not trust to keep them well. That is something. It is something, he agreed, and he turned a book over in his hands and set it on the shelf. In the winter of 1881, the railroad came to Harlow Creek. Not through the corridor that Kellum had been pushing, which had been abandoned when the speculation company ran out of financing, but through a different route that came in from the northeast and passed south of town. And when it came as an actual railroad rather than a pressure campaign, with fair negotiations conducted by people who had learned from the Palo Pinto County situation that hostile land acquisition generated the kind of legal and newspaper attention that cost more than fair pricing. Isaiah sold an easement across a corner of his eastern range for a figure that was genuinely fair and which did not threaten the integrity of the property, and the railroad station that went up just south of Harlow Creek in the spring of 1882 opened the town to a commerce that changed it slowly and without destroying it, which was the best outcome available. Reuben Fitch, who had spent years managing incoming information by stagecoach and occasional freight wagon, found that the railroad accelerated the flow of newspapers and goods and people in ways that meant he had to expand his store, which he did with the enthusiasm of a man whose core interest was being at the center of things, and the expanded general store became the best supplied between San Angelo and El Paso, which was a genuine improvement in quality of life for the entire region. Julia's school grew with the town. By 1882, she had more students than the original schoolhouse could hold, and the town approved the construction of a second room, which doubled the school's capacity and required Julia to take on an assistant, a young woman named Margaret Holt, who had come to Harlow Creek with her parents on the railroad, and who had a degree from a teacher's normal school in Missouri, and who turned out to be precisely the kind of person Julia needed. Someone capable and direct who disagreed with her occasionally, and was usually worth listening to when she did. Sam Ellsworth, who was 3 years old in 1882 and possessed of his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn precision, attended the school his mother ran with a proprietary air that his classmates initially found impressive and later found unremarkable, as children adapt to things. He was not given special treatment. Julia was very clear about that, but he was also, it had to be said, well prepared for school by virtue of having grown up in a house where books were treated as companionable objects, and where dinner-table conversation included references to things that had happened before the people at the table were born. And so he learned quickly and asked good questions, and occasionally corrected the other children's spelling in a way that required his mother's intervention. In 1883, Julia was pregnant again. She told Isaiah on a Tuesday evening in March with the same composure she had brought to it the first time, and he received it with the same depth of feeling he had shown then, somewhat more immediately accessible this time because he had already been through the revision of his emotional vocabulary that becoming a father required. "Are you well?" he asked, because the first pregnancy had not been uncomplicated and he remembered the difficult weeks. "Well enough," she said. "The mornings are worse this time." "Dr. Hartwell says that varies. You will see Hartwell in Minden next week, yes." He brought her tea in the mornings for the weeks when the nausea was worst, without making a ceremony of it, setting it on the table with a piece of dry bread, and going out to start his own day. And she drank it and thought about how love in its actual form was not primarily what happened in moments of declaration and decision, but what happened in the accumulation of small and careful attentions. The tea and the too strong coffee, and the shelves for books, and the waiting and the patience, and the closing of distances that ought never to have been built. Their daughter was born in October of 1883, on a clear autumn day when the leaves of the single cottonwood that stood at the corner of the house had gone yellow gold. She was born with the same insistent noise Sam had announced himself with, and with a quantity of dark hair that both Agnes and Dr. Hartwell commented on. And Isaiah held her in the same careful way, and looked at Julia over the baby's head with the open expression she had first seen that afternoon at the barn, and she thought that expression was perhaps her favorite thing in the world. They named her Margaret Clara Ellsworth, Margaret after the schoolteacher's assistant who had become a friend, and Clara for Isaiah's mother, who had died when he was young, and whom he had spoken about with a quiet tenderness that Julia had filed away and remembered. They called her Clara from the beginning, and she was from her earliest weeks a different kind of child than Sam had been, more watchful, less immediately vocal, given to the long examination of things before committing to a reaction. Sam, who was 4 when Clara was born and had spent those 4 years being the entire population of the Ellsworth children, adjusted to his sister with some negotiation and eventual genuine affection, which Julia monitored and Isaiah navigated with the patience that was his characteristic response to things that required patience. And by the time Clara was 6 months old, Sam had appointed himself her primary informant about the world, telling her in his 4-year-old gravity about horses and tools, and the names of all the cattle and the plot of every book his mother read aloud at night, which was a great deal of information for a 6-month-old, but which Clara received with the patient attention that was already her distinguishing quality. The years settled into the kind of steady fullness that does not make a dramatic story, but constitutes a life of genuine richness. The Ellsworth ranch grew in careful increments, not ambitiously but solidly, and by 1885 Isaiah had added a second barn and expanded the herd to the point where Coop and Dell, who had both passed 50 and were beginning to find the heavy work harder, required additional help, and a young man named Archero Reyes, whose family had ranched in the county since before the Anglo settlement, and who had grown up knowing cattle in the deep way of people for whom it is a full tradition rather than a profession, came to work on the Ellsworth place, and proved to be the kind of hand who made everything function better than it had before. Archero was 23 and spoke English with a precision that came from having learned it alongside Spanish rather than instead of it, and he had opinions about horses and cattle and the management of range land that were worth having, and Isaiah listened to them, which was the thing about Isaiah that people who worked for him noticed and remembered, that he listened to people who knew things without requiring them to frame those things in ways that made him comfortable. And this extended naturally to understanding that the people who had ranched this land before the Anglo settlers had knowledge of it that was genuinely worth having. The injustices of the period were not invisible from Harlow Creek. Julia saw them in the county, in the way that Mexican landowners like the Reyes family had lost significant portions of their holdings in the decades since the Texas land adjustments, in the way that the Comanche bands who had ranged this territory for generations had been pushed onto reservation land in Indian Territory following the Red River War of 1874. Events that had concluded 4 years before Julia arrived in Harlow Creek, but whose consequences were visible in the landscape, and in the occasional encounters with displaced people moving through the region. She taught her students what she knew and what was honest about the history of the land they lived on, not with the aim of producing guilt, but with the aim of producing understanding, because she believed, as she had believed since she first stood in front of a classroom, that understanding was the only foundation on which people could build anything worth living in. Isaiah shared this belief without it being something they had needed to align on, because it was in him already from the Tennessee formation, from the brother who had come home from the war changed, and had spoken about what he had seen with a directness that had shaped Isaiah's understanding of what people were capable of, and what that meant for how they ought to be treated. In 1886, the Whitmore family had a sorrow. Harold Whitmore, who had been Agnes's husband for 39 years and whose cousin Fletcher's land office records had been so useful during the Kellum situation, died in February of a heart that had been failing quietly for a year without anyone clearly knowing it. Agnes was devastated in the way that people are devastated by the loss of the life they had built with someone, not destroyed but altered in a fundamental way. And Julia was with her through the first weeks with the steady presence that she had learned from being loved well, bringing food and sitting with Agnes in the evenings, and not requiring her to be anything other than what she was. Isaiah had known Harold for as long as he had been in Harlow Creek, and he helped with the practical matters that death required, the estate and the property and the questions that needed answering. And he did it with the undemonstrative competence that was characteristic of him in all practical things. Agnes accepted this help with a gratitude that was genuine and simple, and that she expressed once directly, telling Isaiah and Julia together that Harold had liked Isaiah from the beginning, from before Julia had arrived, and had said more than once that Julia was lucky to have him, which Agnes amended immediately to say that of course they were lucky to have each other. "He was right," Julia said. "I am lucky to have him." Isaiah, who was not given to sentimentality in public, looked at his wife with the expression she knew from the barn and the baby and all the accumulated years of knowing him, and Agnes cried for the 5th time in connection with Isaiah and Julia, and did not seem embarrassed about it at all. Coop married Mrs. Patterson in the summer of 1886, which was something the town had been expecting since at least 1879, and which had taken longer than necessary by most calculations. And the wedding was a small affair at the church that the Ellsworth family attended with Sam, who was 7 and wore his good shirt without complaint, and Clara, who was 2.5 and spent the ceremony on Julia's lap, examining the ribbons of the woman seated in front of them with focused determination. Coop, who had been complaining about various aspects of existence since Isaiah had known him, stopped complaining about the ones that related to having someone to come home to, and this improvement in his general outlook made him, if anything, a better rancher, because his complaints became more specific and therefore more actionable. Dell, who had never shown any inclination toward matrimony, had by this point been given a small portion of the Ellsworth place to live on, and was, as far as anyone could determine, entirely contented, spending his time between ranch work and the care of the Ellsworth children, with an investment in both that suggested he had found the arrangement that suited him, which Julia thought was a perfectly good arrangement, and said so when people implied that Dell's bachelor status was a lack of something. In the spring of 1887, Sam Ellsworth turned 8 years old and came to his mother one afternoon after school with a look on his face that she recognized as the look of someone who has been thinking about something for some time and has decided it is time to say it. He sat at the kitchen table while she was preparing supper and said, "Mother, Archero told me that his grandfather's family had land where our eastern pasture is now." Julia set down what she was doing and looked at her son. "He told you that?" "He did, He said he did not say it to cause trouble. He said it because he thought I should know the history of the land. He was right to tell you, Julia said. She sat down at the table with Sam. Do you know why he thought you should know? Sam considered this with the attentive gravity he had from both parents. Because it is part of understanding where we are. Yes, Julia said. Because knowing the history of a place, even the parts that are difficult, is the only way to understand it honestly. An honest understanding is better than comfortable ignorance, even when it is harder. Sam was quiet for a moment. What do we do about it? We cannot undo what was done before we were born, Julia said. But we can be fair and honest in how we act now. We can treat the people whose families were here before us with respect. We can listen when they tell us what they know about this land. And we can be honest with our children about what happened. She looked at him. Which I am doing now with you. Sam nodded. He had his father's way of receiving important information, without drama but with full absorption. All right, he said. He went to find Archero the following morning and had a conversation that Julia did not hear but about which Archero told her afterward with a slight smile, that young Sam had asked very good questions and that he had answered them as honestly as he knew how, and that he thought the boy would grow up to be someone worth knowing. He will, Julia said. He already is. The summer of 1887 brought one more piece of the story into its final form. It came in a letter from San Antonio, from a woman named Louise who had been Julia's closest friend in the years before she came to Harlow Creek, and with whom she had maintained correspondence through all the years since. Louise wrote to say that she was coming west to visit, that she had always wanted to see this country Julia wrote about, and that she was bringing her sister and would stay for 2 weeks if that was agreeable. Julia wrote back that it was more than agreeable, that she had been wanting Louise to see this place and this life for years, and that the spare room was ready, and that she would have Isaiah prepare the route from the nearest rail station so that Louise knew what she was coming to. Louise arrived in late July on the same railroad that had come through in 1882, a small and dark-eyed woman who had aged into her beauty in the way of women who had always been more interesting than pretty. And she arrived on the platform of the Harlow Creek station on a Thursday afternoon and stood looking at the flat red land and the enormous sky and said, "Oh," in a way that contained genuine recognition, as if she had known somehow that this was what Julia had meant all those years in her letters. Julia brought her home. She brought her through the schoolhouse she had built and grown, along the main street of the town that had settled into itself over the years since 1875, out to the Ellsworth place with its new barns and its shelved walls of books, and its kitchen with the too-strong coffee and its porch where the cedar smell came in on the evening air. She showed Louise the children, Sam who shook hands with adult gravity and Clara who examined Louise for a long moment before deciding she was acceptable, and offering her a small carved horse that Dell had made, which was her highest compliment, and Louise received it with the right amount of ceremony. And she showed Louise Isaiah, which was really what she had been wanting to do for 3 years of letters, and Louise looked at Isaiah Ellsworth across the supper table on the first evening, and then looked at Julia with an expression that said everything without saying any of it. And Julia looked back with the expression of a woman who knew exactly what she was being told. After supper, when the children were in bed and Isaiah had gone to check on the horses in the way he did at the end of each day, Louise sat with Julia on the porch in the July evening and said, quietly and with the directness of a woman who had known Julia since they were both 20 and therefore had no illusions about her, "You almost missed this, did you not?" It was not a question, and Julia did not treat it as one. "Yes," she said, "for 3 years nearly. I kept building a distance and not noticing I was building it. But you stopped. He made it impossible to maintain," Julia said, "not by pushing. By simply being what he was, consistently and without apology, until the maintenance of the distance started to feel more effortful than the risk of the alternative." Louise was quiet for a moment. The Texas evening was warm and full of its particular sounds, and the stars were doing their thing above them, generous and uncountable. "That is a remarkable thing," Louise said. "He is a remarkable person," Julia said. "Not in a dramatic way, in the way that matters more." Louise went back to San Antonio after 2 weeks with the look of a woman whose understanding of something had been altered, and she wrote Julia a letter from the road that arrived a week later, and said, simply, that she understood now, and that she was glad, and that the children were the best argument for life that she had encountered in some time. Julia read the letter at the kitchen table on a morning when Isaiah was out in the eastern field, and Sam was at school, and Clara was with Dell in the barn. And she sat with the letter in her hand and looked at the room around her, at the shelves of books from 2 families and the kitchen with the too strong coffee smell, and the morning light coming in through the window that she had been waking to for 9 years. And she felt the completeness of things in the way you can only feel it after you have been afraid of it and chosen it anyway. Isaiah came in from the field at mid-morning for coffee, as was his habit, and he found her at the table with the letter, and he poured his coffee and sat across from her, and she told him what Louise had written, and he listened in the way he listened to things she valued, with his full attention and without any hurry. "She is right about the children," he said. "She is, but she was writing about more than the children." He looked at her over his coffee. "I know," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, her hand that had touched this country for 12 years now and knew the texture of it, and his hand that had built the thing they were living in with all of its solidity and warmth and too strong coffee. He turned his hand over and held hers, as he had held it on the evening she had told him about Sam, with the carefulness of someone holding something he knew the value of. Outside, the Texas morning was going about its business. The wind in the cedar and the cattle in the east pasture and Archer Row singing something in Spanish from the direction of the barn, and Clara's voice answering him with the single-minded certainty of a 3-year-old who has something important to say, and Dell's laughter at whatever she had said. The distance that Julia had built so carefully, and maintained so long and forgotten so completely, that she had mistaken it for the natural condition of herself, was gone. It had been gone for 9 years, closed by the specific and unhurried love of a man who had understood the difference between what she was and what she was doing, and who had waited with the patience of someone who trusted the eventual change of weather. She had built it out of fear, and the learned patterns of a life that had taught her that loving openly was dangerous, that the things you reached for could be taken or could fail to be what they seemed. And Isaiah had not dismantled those fears with argument or with pressure, but simply by being present and honest and constant, until the fears had less foundation than the reality. This was, she thought, on that morning in 1887, with her hand in his and the Texas air coming in through the window, the whole of it. Not a dramatic story, not a story of obstacles overcome and enemies defeated, though there had been those, and not a story of misunderstandings resolved through declaration, though there had been those too. A story about the longer and quieter thing, about the distance people build against the best of what is available to them, and about the patience and the love that can, if the person doing the building is lucky enough and honest enough to eventually notice what they have been doing, close that distance for good. Sam came home from school that afternoon with a drawing he had made of the ranch, careful and detailed in the way of children who pay attention to the actual shape of things, and he put it on the kitchen table and said it was for both of them. And Clara came in from the barn with hay in her hair and the carved horse still in her hand, and went directly to her father's knee. And Isaiah set her up there with the ease of a man who had been doing that for 3 years and never lost the pleasure of it. Julia made supper. It was a good supper, the kind that came from knowing what people in your house liked and having the means to provide it, and they ate it together at the table where so many evenings had happened, with the books on the walls and the too strong coffee in the pot, and the children talking about everything that had happened in their small days, and the evening light coming through the west window and lying gold across the floor. After supper, after the children were in bed, Isaiah and Julia sat on the porch in the cooling evening, as they had sat on so many evenings across so many years, and she leaned against him and he held her, and the Texas night came down warm and full of stars. "Are you happy?" he asked, which was a question he asked occasionally, not from doubt but from the particular care of a man who did not assume he knew but wanted to know. "Yes," she said, with the simplicity of absolute truth. "Completely." He pressed his lips to her hair and said nothing more, because nothing more was needed, and the night went on around them. The insects and the wind and the distant cattle and the stars above the flat and endless Texas plain. And the distance between them was only the natural air that living creatures require to breathe, inhabited and warm and entirely shared. The school would open again in September, and Sam would start the upper primer, and Clara would grow from 3 to 4 with the decisive pace she brought to everything, and the ranch would go into the good autumn with the herd strong, and the fences sound and Archero's careful management of the East Range, and Coop would keep being married with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally gotten a thing right. And Agnes would come to Sunday dinner with the composure of a woman who had learned that life continued and remained worth living. And Harlow Creek would keep being what it was, a small and stubborn town pressed into the red dirt of West Texas, finding its way through each year with the pragmatic hopefulness that such places required. And Julia Ellsworth, who had been Julia Carver, who had come west on a stagecoach with 2 trunks and a box of books, and a talent for building distances she did not know she had, would go on being exactly where she was, which was exactly where she wanted to be, and the distance was closed and it stayed closed, and that was the whole of the story, and it was enough, and it was everything.